So, as I was mentioning before, I want to now go through the real, but the very real story of Hanukkah. A lot of what I'm about to say are based on the book called Once Upon a Soul by Chanuka, who wrote it many years ago. In it, he has a section, historical discussion and telling of the Hanukkah story and putting it in the proper perspective. It's very important to know what the real story of Hanukkah is and to know what, therefore, the real miracle was and how it applies to us in our times. If you miss the whole point of the real story, then you miss the whole point of how it's supposed to affect us nowadays and all throughout the exile, the Gullus, the long Gullus. The story of Hanukkah really takes place many years before that under the rule of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a clever and mighty ruler from Macedonia that amassed in his 33 years of life. I mean, when you think about it, it's absolutely amazing what he was able to accomplish in 33 years. He amassed an empire that took over pretty much the whole entire world. Europe, what was then Europe, Asia, and what was Africa. Did it in a few interesting ways. He was not considered one of the most violent and cruel rulers. He actually encouraged people through economic promises, through cultural promises, to join basically his team, his alliance, so to speak. And he was a Hellenist. He was definitely Greek influenced in his ideology, clearly. And his mission, so to speak, was not just to take control over all these nations that he controlled, but his mission was to bring Greek culture, which is in his mind was the enlightenment, was the refinement of the world, to the rest of the world. If you look, interestingly enough, the only country in the whole, or the area in the whole world known at the time that he did not take over was Israel. If you look at an accurate map of Alexander the Great's empire, you will see that where Israel is, there's a little space that showing that part he did not take over. You have some of the more inaccurate ones that just do the whole thing as his empire, but the accurate ones will leave that as a space because historically he did not take over Israel. The Gemara recounts the story that when Alexander the Great was marching on Jerusalem, at that time, one of the great Jewish leaders, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous, who was the last of the men of the Great Assembly, that body of great Torah scholars and leaders and innovators that took us through the 70 years of exile and enabled us to actually manage without a temple. After the first temple, they bridged that gap between the end of the first temple and the beginning of the second temple, and instituted rules for us with which we're able to manage without a temple in the time of the exile. Shimon HaTzadik was the last of that men of the Great Assembly. At that time, Jerusalem was humming with Torah, with all kinds of great things. Beis Hamikdash was in its glory. Everything was being done in purity and organization and cleanliness, and it was just fantastic. When Alexander the Great was marching on Jerusalem, so this is the Gemara in Tamid tells the story as follows: that Shimon the Tzaddik dressed up in his impressive priestly garments and asked his assistants to come with him and accompany him. He's going out to meet the great Alexander the Emperor. And as he comes close to Alexander, Alexander's on his horse. When Alexander sees Shimon the Tzaddik, he gets off his horse and bows down to Shimon the Tzaddik. His generals and his entourage was like stunned. What are you bowing down to this Jew? For what? He says, you should know. You think that it was just my great, military acumen, my great military knowledge that enabled me to capture all these nations and amass my great empire? Every time before a big battle, he would appear to me in a dream and tell me the best strategy in which to wage the upcoming war. Shimon the Tzaddik then invited Alexander to come to Jerusalem. They made a tremendous welcome for him. He comes into Jerusalem. He was so impressed by what he saw there, the beauty of it, the organization of it, the calm and holiness of it all. He decided he's not going to take over Israel. He'll let Israel run as it is, without any influence, without any control from him whatsoever. In order to honor him for that, the Jewish people did a few things. Two of the things were that they officially allowed Alexander to be a Jewish name, and you were allowed to call your child Alexander. And we have some great rabbis that were named Alexander. And the second thing was they allowed his face to be minted on the coin. And until then, there was no non-Jewish or no outside person that's face was minted on the coins of Israel. What seemed like a tremendous honor to a great person, which it was, began to sow the seeds of Hellenistic culture, taking its root into the culture of the pure culture of religious Judaism. And to make a longer story shorter, fast forward, as time went on, more and more aspects, because it seemed that that Alexander was a good thing, many people began to try to bring in, like once the foot was in the door, a lot more things started to come through. A lot more aspects of Greek culture found its way into Judaism and began to influence the Jewish people in a way that was not so good. So then, again, there always were different sides of Judaism. There was always the more religious, the less religious. There was constantly like that from the very, very beginning. But the less religious began to have something to latch onto as an ideology, to develop it and to strengthen it. A few years later, as I said, Alexander died at 33 years old. He was a young man, he had no heirs, he had no children. So his empire was divided between three generals. One general took Macedonia and Europe. Another one was Ptolemy. He took Egypt and Africa. And Seleucid, he took Asia and the Middle East. And Israel was at that time in the middle. Now, because they had a buy, for example, they were not under the control of Alexander, So they were up for grabs. And the country of Israel, after Alexander died, fluctuated and between the control of Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic dynasty and Seleucid and that dynasty, Seleucus and the Seleucid dynasty. So there were times when Ptolemy and that dynasty was in charge of Israel, and then there were times when the others would take it, and it would go back and forth. The common denominator was that they pretty much they let the Jewish people be, for the most part, to run their Beis Hamikdash and their country the way they saw fit. But they were there to institute pretty much oppressive taxes against the Jewish people. So whoever took the prize of Israel took the taxes. And that was what basically they were fighting for back and forth. Ptolemy, that was the Egyptian, and then Seleucid, and then later on Antiochus, were the kings from that dynasty, because the seat, the capital, was in Antioch. And these dynasties were built and based on Greek culture. They were not Greek, so it's a little bit of a misnomer to call them Greeks, but they were Hellenists, definitely and clearly. And the Hellenist ideology was a very physical an ideology that believed in the body, in nature, in the lack of a God, the lack of one God controlling everything. It was a ideology where you would just fulfill your great physical desires, and pretty much nothing was more important than what you wanted for yourself, for your physical and emotional desire. Sound familiar, correct? Pretty much what the immoral left ideology is today. Now, as I said, for the most part, the rulers of the dynasties left the Jewish people alone. And they just were fighting about who was the one to take the Jewish money. Within Israel, the cultural war of Hellenists versus religious Jewry began to take place. The liberal left versus the conservative right among Jewish people, that was the big fight. And just like you have today, the left was doing whatever it can to undermine religious Judaism, to undermine the study of Torah, the keeping of Shabbos, and all the other Rosh Chodesh, Bris Milah, all the things which identified us as religious Jews. They did their best to remove themselves from it, and of course they were never happy to just remove themselves from that. They wanted to bring down all of Judaism, to influence them all. And then when it didn't work through influence, then they tried to use force. Also at the same time, they corrupted all the major offices of religious Jewry. The Sanhedrins, the courts, the Jewish courts, the office of the high priest, which used to be handed down father to son to the most deserving of the priests. It was a holy, holy position, became a government position, and was bought and sold for whoever would pay for it. Till eventually, the high priest wasn't even a priest. And the Jewish left was doing whatever it could, to bring down religious Judaism in many different ways. They took over the office of high priest. It was a position now that belonged not only to a priest, but to a big leftist, to a big Hellenist, and they tried to force the rules They were very much against the learning of Torah, against the keeping of Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Bris Milah, circumcision, things like that. But they couldn't really completely realize their goal to completely drive it out. When this whole office of high priest was being fought over, and they threw the real high priest out, and they took it over as a government position. So the real high priest, Chanya, he ran away to Antioch to hide, because he was pretty much afraid for his life, because the worst thing for them would be to have the high priest come back and take back the power and get together perhaps a revolution in their minds against their leftist ideas and their leftist control. So he went to Antioch to pretty much in exile to hide out, but they were still afraid. The Jewish leftists were still afraid that him being alive would threaten their control over power. So they sent representatives to Antioch to assassinate Chanya the high priest. They assassinated him in Antioch and dragged his body through the streets. Now that, unfortunately, or maybe it's what they wanted, that got the notice of the ruler, who at that time was Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, what they call him, the Mad. And when he heard that and he saw that, he got a little bit nervous that these Jewish people are a little bit out of control. So he decided that, and again, I'm simplifying it. It's a little bit more than that. But he decided that he has to now be involved a little bit more in what's going on in Israel. The left welcomed this and encouraged him to come in and blamed it on this religious Jewish people. And he said, you know what, you come in and you help us to stamp out this religiousness, then you'll be much, much better off. They won't have these Jewish people causing all this trouble. We'll make sure, and you help us, because it's this Shabbos and this Rosh Chodesh and this, Torah and all that stuff. That's what's causing the problem. Again, if it sounds familiar to what's happening now, it's not an accident. So, and he did. He came in, or he sent representatives. They right away. That may have happened before, but they clearly made the Beis Hamikdash into a Greek pagan temple, and they instituted very strict anti-religious rules that was being encouraged, and actually they worked together with the non-religious left and the government to stamp out religious Judaism. In that particular moment, in that particular time, you can't imagine a more hopeless feeling if you were a God-fearing, Torah-observant Jew. There was nowhere to turn, literally nowhere to turn. High priest? No. The courts? No. Nothing. And in that time, there rose the leader, Yehuda Maccabee, from the family of the Chashmonaim, a family of Kohanim, and he got a small group of people together, pretty much like a band of guerrillas almost, hiding out in the caves, Modi'in, and attacking, raids every now and then. And then eventually, the amazing miracle took place that this small group of pretty much, untrained soldiers, not even soldiers, right, were able to defeat the army of the Seleucid Empire from Antioch. And what people don't understand, it wasn't It was much, much more than a physical military battle that took place over here. Because that wasn't the major war. That was just an aspect of it that was that the left's desire to destroy the Torah, true Judaism, was being assisted by the big army of the empire. But that wasn't the major problem. The major problem was the ideological war that took place and the ideological victory. And that was even a more amazing victory than the actual physical battle, which is why in the Alanissa, which is the prayer we add to the Shemona Esrei on Hanukkah, we say, very interestingly, so they ask the question that there's basically, Hanukkah is the commemoration of two distinct miracles that took place. The first miracle was, they say, the war that the small group of people beat and defeated the huge empire's army. And then there was the miracle that after they cleaned out the temple, they were looking for oil to light the menorah, to rededicate it. They only wanted to use pure oil, and they couldn't find. And finally, they managed to find one little jug of pure oil. In those days, they would measure out a day's worth of oil in a jug and seal it. And every day they would open a new jug, pour out the oil, and then throw it away or whatever, and then have another jug for the next day. They only found one jug, which would last for one day, and the miracle was that the oil lasted for 8 days instead of one. But when we read this Al HaNisim prayer in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amidah of every day, we don't even mention the miracle of the oil. We just mention the miracle of the war. So why is that? And the reason is because the miracle of the war was the whole thing. Because it wasn't just an oppressive non-Jewish regime trying to destroy the Jews. It was an ideological battle for the whole salvation of the Jewish people. From Jew against Jew. You had the corrupt left that was ingrained in every aspect of Jewish society. And you had people that were believing and following the left's ideology. So you had two things. You had the people in control of power, in government, in the courts, in every aspect were the left. And then the ideology of the people that were not in control were also influenced, and in the schools and everywhere they were being taught the ideology of the left. So if you just won the physical war, big deal. What did you accomplish if the ideology of the left is still there? So the most amazing miracle was that the small group of people were able to drive out the left out of power, and not only out of power, but so that the average person did not anymore believe in the ideology of the left, but believed in the ideology of Torah true Judaism. That is the most amazing thing. That's not even understandable how it can happen. It's one thing to win a physical battle, but how do you automatically flip everybody's thinking to the right way of thinking? And that's what happened. And not only that, it was done without force. You can't force people to think differently. You have to impress upon them to think differently. You can force a military win, but you can't force an ideological win. But that's what happened there. And that's why this miracle of Hanukkah is so much more applicable to what we're going through today. Because when we look at the left today, we see their influence, their ideology everywhere, and we say we are lost. We go to court, and they're in charge. We go here, they're in charge. They cheat here, they cheat there. I mean, how's it going to ever be? You think they didn't cheat then? I'm sure they cheated then. If they assassinated the high priest, I'm sure they cheated too. So suddenly, Yehuda Maccabee, Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the high priest, they take control and they are able to change the ideology of the people. Now that's an amazing thing. That's why when, if you look at the prayer of Al Anisim, it says as follows: in the days of Matizio, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, he was a Chashmonai from the family of Chashmonai, his sons, when the wicked Hellenistic kingdom stood up against the Jewish people to make them forget their Torah, to move them away from the rules that you, God, want them to follow, and you, in your great mercy, stood up for them in the time of their trouble and did the following 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things. Or 7, we'll see in a second. Because each one of these things is another aspect of the victory that only could have happened with God's help. It's impossible. And each one of these was an amazing miracle. First of all, you judged their judgment. You fought their fight. You avenged their revenge. You gave over the strong people in the hands of the weak. You gave over the many in the hands of the few. The impure in the hands of the pure. The wicked you gave over in the hands of the righteous. And the criminals in the hands of those who learn and study and involve themselves with your Torah. Every single aspect. I'm going to go into each and every one of them right now. But obviously, if the prayer lists all these different things, each and every one of these things was a different aspect of the miracle. It's not repeating the same thing over all these times. Each one was a different aspect. The physical, military battle of the mighty, of the strong army falling into the hands of the weak, of the large army falling into the hands of the small, of the few fighters, of the impure ideology being just destroyed by the pure ideology, wicked, and all these different things, was another aspect of the victory that changed the whole nature of the society, which could only have happened with God's help, and which was absolutely unbelievable and impossible, and it had to have been a complete open miracle for everyone to see. To see that it wasn't enough to take over the temple and clean it out and make it back into the Beis HaMikdash. But if the insidious ideology of the left was still in every single corner of if every single child's mind or every single adult's mind, it had to be, and it was changed. There obviously was something that was so magnificent with the help of God. So that aspect of that took place is exactly what we're fighting against now. And a matter of fact, as I mentioned before, that every single of one of the three major redemptions has an aspect that is going to be taking place now in the final redemption. Because we're not threatened, thank God, at this moment with our lives. And a matter of fact, the battle now between the right and the left isn't even targeting Jews. It's targeting everyone with a sense of morality. Jew, Christian, Muslim. They want to shut down every house of worship, not just the synagogues. They want to destroy every sense of morality, not just Jewish morality. A Jewish person is able to keep whatever religion he wants to keep. Whatever rules and laws, and just now you have to do it in your house. But you can keep everything. There's no rules against that. So it's a different aspect. So, but the complete overreaching power of the left is there as it was during the story of Hanukkah. So what we're waiting for now is this salvation that took place in Hanukkah, where the left will be completely destroyed through miraculous ways, even if we don't have a Yehuda Maccabee or a Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol who's going to fight the fight. We still may, but even if we don't, that'll happen the way it happened in the time of Egypt, that God will do it all. We'll have a complete turnabout, like we have in Purim. The left will be completely turned upside down on their heads, just like they were in Purim. Even though we may not have in Mordechai and Esther and the unity of all the Jewish people following together, but we'll still have that napachu, that turnabout, that upside flipping around of things, exactly the opposite of what they really want to do. And we'll have the complete annihilation and silencing of the left, just like it happened in Hanukkah. And that's what we're asking for this Hanukkah. And that's what we're thanking God for. And that's what we signify. When we light the candles, we're signifying not just the fact that the oil lasted for 8 days. We're signifying that there was a complete cleansing of every single physical, spiritual, and ideological aspect, and a turnabout to a clean, Torah observant, moral, in this case, moral world, where the immorality, the indecency, the cheating, the lying, all the garbage of the left is going to be completely destroyed. And may we pray then, this Hanukkah, as it is within this Thursday night, the first candle, just like Hanukkah on this side of the world. In Australia, it's always in the summertime, so we can't say that. But on this side of the world, it is always the shortest, the time of the year when the daylight is the shortest, where the nights are the longest. And we're in that situation now, where it looks like there is no salvation, where the power and the tyranny of the governments to control and destroy the economies and the livelihoods of them, and the mental health and of all the people that are under their controls is working, where the cheating and the arrogance of the left is working. We're in a darkness that seems so frustrating and so hopeless. Don't worry. It happened before. It happened before 3 different times, and this time it's going to happen all 3 in one. And with God's help, very, very quickly. Happy Hanukkah.